My guest today is by request. I got a couple emails about having this guy on, a couple tweets about having this guy on, and I did some research, and I'm like, I can see why you wanted me to have this guy on. He's doing some very, very interesting work, and I am stoked to talk to him today. He is a professor, he is an author, he is an academic, and he is an activist. So please welcome to the show, without further ado, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel, how are you?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for doing this. You are by request, and I'm excited to talk to you. So,
very honored.
A lot of your work right now is related to fascism. So let's start very basic. In your words, what is fascism?
Fascism is a project, in its classical form. So in the early 20th century, what some people will call classical fascism, with the rise of fascism in Italy and then in Germany, I think can best be understood as a project on the part of the capitalist ruling class to do at least two things. One is to crush the workers' movement and the threat of a communist revolution. And the other is to basically scale up capitalist accumulation to maximize profits as quickly as possible. And that was done through funding the big industrial capital that had an interest in the permanent war economy, in going to colonial wars that would be profitable for the businesses invested in them. And so one kind of, I think, key way of understanding what fascism in this more classical sense is that it was this kind of twofold project of increased capitalist accumulation while crushing the threat of communist organizing, socialist organizing more generally, that was calling into question the very nature of the capitalist order. There's more that could be said about that, though, of course, because as fascism emerged, it was first a movement. It wasn't really a doctrine, and Mussolini himself said this. And so one of the things that's a bit complicated is how you can, talk about the complexities of movements like fascism without trying to reduce it to one really rigid and fixed definition. Because at the end of the day, these are changing processes. And if I could use a mildly kind of intellectual term to describe this, you'd have to have a kind of dialectical approach, meaning you have to recognize that things are in process, there are forces operative, and this isn't a static reality. So maybe just to say one more thing about that is that in the case of Italy and Germany, a lot of people say, well, fascism is when there's a popular base that's mobilized, right? And a lot of people are saying that about what's happened recently in the United States. And this is a kind of classic definition of how fascism operates. It's not just authoritarianism, meaning it's not just state power that is maximizing profits and crushing its opposition. It outsources that labor to vigilantes, to militias, and whatnot. And in the case of both Italy and Germany, that was true at the beginning, but the process evolved. And when the Italians seized state power through a bourgeois democracy, right, they followed the rules. And more or less, I mean, there was some parastate violence going on. And the Nazis did the same. After that, they consolidated their vigilante forces into the state apparatus. So some people will talk of a kind of move from a more populist fascism into a more state-based authoritarianism as they consolidated power. That's just one example, but I think it's really important to recognize how fluid and process-based social reality is, and not get hung up on having one fixed definition that would magically fit all cases.
Well, based on your answer, can fascism exist without capitalism?
Historically, it has not existed without capitalism. And in fact, one of the really good questions is the way it became conceptualized, right, was in the case of Italy, and not at the very beginning of Mussolini's rise to power. It was only later that it became consolidated as a doctrine, as he himself said. But the moment at which it emerged was a moment of extreme capitalist crisis. This was a crisis of, there were multiple dimensions to the crisis. One was the international world war between capitalist powers, World War I, and the fact that that had broken up empire, that capitalist countries were, in a process of decline, the communist revolution, the first workers' revolution, had been successfully attained in the Soviet Union in 1917. And then as you move into the 1920s and the early 1930s, you have the Great Depression and an enormous crisis of the capitalist world system. So the combination of the crisis in the capitalist world system and the communist alternative being an actual real alternative really led to the consolidation of a fascist style politics. And so the great Michael Parenti claimed that fascism is the final solution to class struggle. It's when the capitalists really have their backs against the wall and they need to mobilize vigilante forces in order to shore up capitalism and crush opposition. And a final thing that I'd say about that is it raises a really interesting question about the deeper history of capitalism, because this form of vigilante violence that is pro-capitalist and anti-communist, of course, predates Mussolini and Hitler. And many great thinkers and activists have pointed out the ways in which the history of a settler colony like the United States is marked by vigilante violence, militias that are ultranationalist, that are pro-capitalist, that are anti-communist. And so that's one of the other reasons that I think it's important not to have too rigid of a definition of fascism, because it's based on the assumption that somehow the external world would just conform to our ideas of the world. And instead, we should recognize the complexity of the world and try to make our concepts adhere as much as possible to that complexity. So someone like Aimé Césaire said, well, if you want to understand fascism, don't only recognize fascism when it happens in Europe. You've got to look at the concentration camps that have been built in the colonies and the history of racialized violence in the imperialist expansion of capitalism from its kind of European and then American European centers. And so the whole history of the relationship between 20th century fascism and the deeper history of the colonial projects of capitalist expansion is a really, really important part. And in fact, this isn't just for historical interests, right? We should know that when Hitler's regime really consolidated power, just like in Italy, these were colonial regimes. And that the goal of the Nazi war machine was to conquer the wild, wild East, just as the American settler colony had conquered the wild, wild West. And the idea was that just as the United States had crushed and genocidally eliminated, not entirely, but very significant portions of the indigenous population marching westward, so should the Nazi war machine march eastward to destroy the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy of the barbarians who had established a communist regime or a socialist regime in the East. And so that colonial logic isn't just something in the past, right? It's actually part of the way in which Nazism and Italian fascism operated.
So, lot going on there. So I mean, the way I kind of like to describe what's going on now and what has gone on in the past is, be it our contemporary society or be it Germany after World War I, you have a society that is very much struggling, that is desperate in many ways. And that makes a society that is susceptible to cling to a demagogue, to cling to, very, very fringe ideas, or, they can go the other way and go towards power to the people, power to the workers. And what you're saying is fascism, historically, up to present day, well, they know that, and so they want to crush those latter movements that I mentioned, the workers, to make sure that people go to the demagogues. Is that accurate?
I think that's spot on, because in many ways, one of the things that's interesting about people who are pulled into fascist ideologies is that they identify correctly some of the symptoms. They recognize there's mass unemployment, that people don't have jobs, people don't have health care, that there's a housing crisis, right? And this is of extreme proportions, particularly in the contemporary world. And those people are absolutely 100% right to recognize those realities. The system is broken, right? But the catch is that the ideologues, who are either the capitalist ruling class or the intellectual hench people whom they hire, the kind of professional managerial class who's hired to fabricate the fascist ideology, what they do is they take those symptoms that are very true and then they relate them to causes that are very false. And that is a process of, I always think of it in terms of how ideology works like a gestalt. It kind of frames and forms things. And the facts on the ground can be identical, and it depends on how they're framed ideologically. Like, you know, the famous image of the duck rabbit, where you can look at it and you see it's a duck, but it's also a rabbit. But nothing changes in the image, right? The facts of the image are identical, but you can see it one way or you can see it another way. And if you see it in terms of the fascist solution, then you think that, well, there's unemployment and a healthcare crisis and things like this because immigrants are stealing our jobs, because China is a threat to humanity, because like all of these made up nonsense stories that are circulated through the mass media. But what people who are invested in combating fascism need to know is recognize those facts, right? That there's unemployment, housing crisis, et cetera, but then provide an ideological frame that goes to the root causes of those symptoms. It doesn't use those symptoms and ideologically frame them in an incorrect way for their uses of the capitalist ruling class, but it frames them to diagnose what the disease is. And if you want to know why we have those symptoms, the disease is very easy to discover. It's a disease called capitalism, which has always historically produced all of these problems. Housing, unemployment is integral to the way in which the capitalist system functions. Poverty, the Industrial Reserve Army, you know, all of these symptoms that are very real are just the result of the way the capitalist system functions. And so in many ways, what fascism tries to do is recognize the symptoms of that system, but diagnose them in such a way that people are channeled into shoring up the capitalist system, which is the very system that's responsible for those symptoms in the first place. And that's one of the reasons that that ideology is so pernicious. And of course, the mass media and the culture industries that dominate, obviously in the US, but more broadly in the global situation, are tasked with doing precisely that, not going to the root causes of these issues.
Why do you think, and there's a lot of, I think, answers to this question, and I would say even academia in a lot of ways is guilty of this. Not you specifically, but you know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but not all academics sound like you, Dr. Rockhill, as I'm sure you're well aware. And why do you think, especially in the contemporary United States, there's this mass apology for capitalism? Because it's like, I mean, you hear these people like, well, I mean, every time we try capitalism throughout history, the same thing happens. Can we reel it in? Can we? And it's like, no, you can't, because it's set up to do the exact same thing every frickin' time. And it's like, well, Is that capitalism? Is that? It's capitalism. Are you sure it's not just, it's frickin' capitalism? How do you, like, this is what capitalism is. This is what it does. It does the same thing. It's like, we want the wolf and the sheep to get along, and we talk nicely to the wolf. We put them, we had a little fence separating them, but the wolf keeps the sheep, and I don't know what to think of it. Can we have the wolf behave? No, the wolf's going to eat the sheep. That's what the wolf does.
Exactly.
That's
what a wolf does.
Why do you think there's a mass apology for capitalism, especially in the contemporary United States? Why is that?
Well, it's interesting because you could take the same model that I was just talking about and apply it to the history of professional intellectual life in the United States, meaning what goes on in the kind of imperial academy. And the intellectuals who tend to dominate the mass media or be the kind of pundits and the go-to people and have a big platform are those who are the symptoms of a system. And that system is what, you know, some people would refer to as an ideological state apparatus, meaning that the university is not this free realm of ideas where people are just pursuing the life of the mind. It's a political project through and through. And one of its fundamental functions is to reproduce social inequality. It is to function like an intellectual triage nurse and say, no, these people aren't thinking the way we want our professional managerial class to think, so we're going to fail them out, or we're going to not give them scholarships, we're going to exclude them. And the people who make it to the top are the people who are towing the intellectual line that is that works within the system of capitalist knowledge production. And so one of the book projects that I've actually been working on for a number of years now is entitled The Intellectual World War. And it looks specifically at the war on the very idea of communism or socialism that was undertaken and is an ongoing project on the part of the US state, corporatocracy, and national security state in order to really it's not just a red purge, it's excluding from consciousness the realities of socialist experiments on the ground. And in that regard, even the accounts of fascism that you get within the US Academy, a lot of them are very liberal in the restricted sense of the term, meaning pro-capitalist, not liberal like kind of lefty, but liberal in the sense of, I think that we can just have a system of rights and representation that will work, that was within the framework of capitalism. And that position is itself part of the problem, because then those people think that the way you fight fascism is you vote Biden into office, for instance, who is a pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, hawkish president. And instead of opening up the spectrum of analysis and looking historically at how people have actually fought and won against fascism, not simply as, to pick up on your metaphor, it's not like building a fence between the wolf and the sheep, or putting a bridle on the wolf, or maybe, we'll just let the wolf in once a week to devour all the sheep, and then, then that'll kind of shore things up. No, the whole point is you kill the wolf. Like, if you really want to figure this out, you get rid of the wolf. And the professional managerial class and the intellectual class within the United States has really been sculpted historically in order to take that option off the table. And it's unbelievably unfortunate. It's understandable from the point of view of the ruling class, right? The last thing that the capitalist ruling class wants is people learning about the actual history of socialism and learning about alternatives to capitalism and other such things. And so one of the more kind of hopeful elements in all of this is there's a very insurgent young group of people who are coming up in this world who recognize that, to put it shortly, the stories that their professors and the journalists in the mainstream are telling them are wrong. And they want more, and they're hungry for more, and they see through it. And there's a lot of not just hope, but like real insurgent force within that. And it's not just young people, but there's a lot of young students whom I interact with who tell me, yeah, this is like ridiculous, the number of lies that I've been told about American history, or about how we can make capitalism better if we just make it a little greener, or other such things.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your